Assalamu alaikum, Pakistan, and welcome to Perspectives. This is Heather Mehdi. Today we have an incredibly exciting conversation with Shuja Nawaz. Shuja Nawaz is the author of, he's an author of many books, but the book we're discussing today is The Battle for Pakistan and the Bitter U.S. Friendship and Tough Neighborhood. Shuja needs no introduction to readers and observers on both sides of this extremely tumultuous and extremely tempestuous relationship between Pakistan and the US. I remember him as a kid. I remember watching Shuja reading the news on PTV. Then Shuja was a kind of an iconic figure in the early days of PTV. And then he moved to the US. Columbia University had a tremendous career in journalism and was also the founder of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Shuja wrote a seminal book, another seminal book earlier called Crossroads on Pakistan, and then this book, The Battle for Pakistan. Shuja, welcome to Perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Heather. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you very much. So Shuja, we'll dive straight into this conversation. This has been the Pakistan-US relationship, as I said, is very tempestuous, very, very temperamental. It's off the rails, on the rails. So why did you write this book in the first place on this relationship?
Well, the book needed to be written because I'd been working in this area since 2008, when my previous book had come out. And I fell into the world of think tanks, which was an accidental introduction, because once the book came out, I was speaking about it and writing about it. And then I was invited to join a task force at the Atlantic Council to come up with a new comprehensive US policy towards Pakistan. And we took a team to Pakistan, and I did a fair amount of the drafting of that report. And I then presented that report in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee room in early 2009, by which time Senator Kerry was the chairman. And the two co-sponsors of that report were Senator Chuck Hagel, a Republican, and Senator Kerry, a Democrat. So it was an interesting beginning into the world of think tanks and the world of trying to be bipartisan, something that I was completely unused to. I began working in Washington as well as in the region and in Europe, and traveling frequently. Once I'd launched the South Asia Center, traveling frequently to the region, particularly to Pakistan and India, and looking at the Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, South Asia region as a whole, so that I could advise people who sought my advice and proffer unsolicited advice through my op-eds and media appearances and so on. So it was natural at some point that there would be a follow-up to Crossed Swords. And the first suggestion came from Amina Sayed at Oxford University Press.
Yes.
Who thought that maybe 3 or 4 chapters could be added to Crossed Swords, making it an even heftier doorstopper of a book. And that they would then reissue it as a new edition, because
and these 3, 4 extra chapters were what, like it was like a prologue to add on the subsequent timelines?
We hadn't talked about that, and
Okay.
I thought that maybe I could try and do a compression of the decade or so after the first book had come out. And so we talked about it, and I attempted my hand at crafting something. And the very first chapter turned out to be 200 pages. And I then proposed to Amina that maybe I should do a new book. And what I would do to assist them with getting Crossed Swords out again, because they were running out of the paperback now, was to do a new essay to be added to Crossed Swords. So a kind of a new introduction and a new essay that would try and compress things and bring them up to date which we did. And so the new edition was launched in 2017, the second edition of Cross Swords. And then I began working in earnest on the new book. And the way I went about it was I decided that I would go back to most of the people that I'd worked with in the United States, in the region, and in Europe, and ask them to go on the record with interviews. And Heather, this was really one of the more gratifying parts of beginning this book, because the first book, I was a novice. By this time, I knew people, I knew how to write a book. And almost 80% of the people that I approached agreed to sit down on the record. So I have actually recorded interviews and transcripts of those interviews, which are the basis.
Shuja, this is so interesting, and I didn't want. I want you to continue on, but I just wanted to interject and mention. I tried and counted the number of people that you referred in your book, and I'm sure there are other than it. But we're talking of about maybe 80 to 100 people on both sides of the divide. I mean, we're talking prime ministers, presidents, 30 odd generals on the Pakistani side, prime ministers, presidents, and on the US side, again, huge senior policymakers, senior government guys who were actually in the thick of the battle, military leaders, diplomats. So I, when I was reading it, and I'll be honest, Shuja, when I read it the first time, skimmed through it like you do. But when I was preparing for this and I read it with a tooth comb, I was incredibly impressed. It is, I don't know if you'll take this as a compliment, but I thought it was like Bob Woodwardsian in the way it covered the landscape. Most of the stuff that you've written, people know kind of at the tip of the iceberg, but I think you went so deep down, and I'm using a phrase, forensically, so deep into the detail, who said what, when, why, and you use the phrase to what impact, that we were able to literally follow this blow by blow account of this topsy-turvy seesawing battle, ranging from strategic to transactional, and then this massive filter of the Afghanistan barrier coming in between the relationships. But that's a very interesting thing.
Well, as far as I was concerned, I was using my journalistic skills that I'd been taught and that had developed over the years. And also the fact that one is dealing with people that know their stuff, people that I respected, that I worked with on all sides. And they respected me enough to be able to confide their innermost thoughts or whatever they could confide without breaking the bounds of security and classification. And then I did have access to documents that people were kind enough to share with me so that I could supplement whatever I wrote and provide sourcing wherever it was possible. My wife, who reads every word I write, tells
You're
me,
lucky when mine doesn't.
she said that your footnotes are more interesting than your book. And it may be.
It is.
The footnotes are important because they tell you where the information came from, and they also give you some of the other detail that if it was put in the main body of the text, it would take you away on a byway, take you away from the main story. So it allows you to tell many stories, and that's what I've done. And I was very grateful, and my thanks to Penguin Random House that did the South Asia edition, and then Liberty that did the Pakistan edition, that they agreed that they would allow the footnotes to be footnotes and not endnotes.
Yes.
Now, as readers, you and I hate the idea of going to the back of the book or the back of the chapter to see what was said and who said it and when was it said. This allows you to, without a break, go down to the bottom of the page and then back up again and continue.
Perfectly.
So I'm very grateful that that carried on into the US edition that Roman and Littlefield published. And so that is how the book came into being. I had a box full of my contemporary notes from all my meetings and where I had taken notes, and people knew that I wasn't going to break their confidence. But when I went back to them to get the interviews with them, I had permission to then cite many of those meetings and what transpired.
Thank you for this context, Shuja. Let's get straight into the book. So the title is interesting, and I know you had an earlier title which you changed, and but there's another aspect to it, and I do want to get into this because I didn't find anything in this book that was overly alarming to anybody, especially on the Pakistani side. But you weren't in some way or the other not allowed to launch it in December last year when you were in Pakistan. Would you be able to shed some light on it? And then I'm going to go straight into the book, and because we need to talk about the book as well.
Certainly. First, on the title, my original working title I thought was a clever one. It was called Misalliance, which is the English word taken from the French mésalliance, which means a marriage between unequal social
Yes.
partners. And so when I sent out the book, one of the editors, the editor-in-chief at Rowman and Littlefield, came back and thought that that was a little too nerdy and too exclusive and might not make sense to a lot of people. And so I had other titles, and she took the subtitle or part of the subtitle, and we called it The Battle for Pakistan, because it is not the battle of Pakistan. It's a battle, in my view, for the soul of Pakistan and the future of Pakistan. And it is focused on the bitter US friendship and, of course, the tough neighborhood. So Afghanistan looms large, India looms large, Iran and China come into it as needed. So that was the background. Now, in the launch in Pakistan in December was cancelled by the military at the behest of the army chief because his extension, and this is my view, this is not something that he conveyed to me, but because the extension was still up in the courts at that time. And
so people thought it may have
they were concerned that my launches would provoke all kinds of discussion and commentary that might mess up the situation. My reaction was that the book had been out in South Asia since September, and in Pakistan since November. It was already in the market. People around the world were reading it. Amazon had gotten copies that it was distributing worldwide. So it was really, the horse had bolted from the stable. And so I refused to cancel my events, which they had suggested should happen a few months later. And when I refused, they went ahead and canceled everything.
So good for that. So Shuja, the book, Pakistan calls the US a fair weather friend. The US says, we get taken for a ride. We've given 67 billion over, about 70 billion over so many. Pakistan says, they don't understand the nuances of the neighborhood. We've done everything. We've lost 70,000 people. They don't understand the nuances of the relationship in the neighborhood, where we're seen through the Afghan screen and all that thing. And security is being the paramount filter, which is driving, certainly for the last 2 decades or so, driving the US approach towards Pakistan. So how do you see this this evolution of the relationship, which was very strategic, post Second World War, Cold War, and then kind of became totally transactional?
Well, all countries basically manage their foreign affairs on the basis of enlightened self-interest.
Correct.
So you have to be selfish. You have to work with your interest in mind, and then see how you can balance the interest of the other party. It's your friends or your near friends or fast friends, as we call it in Pakistan. And the United States and Pakistan have had this up and down relationship. I have compared it, as have others, to a roller coaster. It goes up and it goes down. And as a result, it is affected not only by what Pakistan does and what the United States does, but also by what India does and what China does and what Iran does. Because, like it or not, Pakistan is in a very critical neighborhood of the world. In my view, and I'm an optimist when it comes to these things, South Asia is probably going to be the center of gravity of the global economy in the 21st century. It is not going to be China, it's not going to be Japan. It's going to be South Asia because it abuts the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean, and it abuts Central Asia. And of course, right next to China itself, which is a huge market as well as an exporter. And so the energy nexus, the trade nexus, old cultural, political, economic, and social ties could bring the region together. And if they do, and if there's connectivity, it would be a much more powerful economic force than the European Union or the United States of America as a whole. And I think that is something to keep in mind, and that is what informs my thinking in making my suggestions at the end of the book, which I do.
Shuja, I'm going to go back to some of the really key things that you brought out, and one is, of course, Afghanistan, because it really covers a large part of the book. I'm going to read two quotes from your book, and there's a really interesting. Bruce Riddle, who puts this historical perspective on the Afghan War, says, "We are in the unusual position as the United States of America of having fought the same war twice from opposite sides." I think this is a remarkable admission of the incredibly convoluted U.S. policy on Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Yes. Well, it also comes in the context of what I describe as the lack of a vision on the part of the United States when it went into Afghanistan. They had goalposts that they kept shifting. And as a result, they confounded their friends and the enemies. So they hadn't anyone to talk to. They initially, as you recall, went in to Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban because they had supported the creation of an Al-Qaeda base in Afghanistan, which had allowed Al-Qaeda to plan and execute an attack on the continental United States. And having done that, they just kind of went into a desultory mode of trying to fix the nation building, policing. The United States doesn't have any experience in policing because they don't have a national police force.
Right.
They, in fact, farmed that out to the Germans, whose policing methods, may or may not have suited the Afghan milieu. And so, in fact, what came out of this whole period, and particularly in my interviews with people like Doug Lute, who was running Afghanistan and Pakistan policy at the White House, when the time came for the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, which is about the time that this book starts, he had a PowerPoint slide that he called 10 Wars. And he described the situation inside Afghanistan as 10 different wars that were being fought by different players for different purposes. So there was confusion all around. And this continued because when I interviewed General Stan McChrystal, with whom I worked closely and, who's in fact a neighbor in Alexandria, Virginia, where we live, Stan explained to me that he also came up with the same idea when he assessed the situation, that the US was fighting 10 different wars. And till it could consolidate its vision and clarify it, it couldn't work. But then, and this is the part that you and I have talked about earlier, if you look at the period from 2001 till now, we have had 19 years of war in Afghanistan and in the region. And the Allies, and the US in particular, has had 19 different commanders.
Shuja, just stop here. You have a military mind. I mean, you're the younger brother of an ex-army chief, General Shuja Nawaz. May God bless his soul. And you're a military family. You know the U.S. side. How could U.S. policymakers, they're the best and the brightest, allow 19 commanders over 19 years in a theater that was so crucial to them? It's just beyond my comprehension.
It's beyond mine too, which is why I decided to put a table in my book listing all the commanders and their tenures. And when you look at it, you see how difficult it would be to prosecute this war effectively. And the
Yes.
question is, you have sent people back to Afghanistan 5, 6, 7 times. There are rotations that keep, occurring. And so you have an army that has suffered as a result of that misdirection and lack of clear vision for its purpose. And you also have uh, the need to reestablish relationships within Afghanistan and with neighboring countries for each commander. And as you know, since you have a military background also, I'm a civilian. But when a military leader arrives, he tends to bring his team.
Absolutely.
And so the previous team disappears. And
Mm.
in the US, particularly, they always have a 100-day target. So they have a
Mm.
plan for the first 100 days.
Mhm.
And when I go back and I look at those commanders and their pronouncements, they're invariably saying, we're turning a corner.
Yeah.
And I've made a quip many times that they turned so many corners that, they didn't know where they were going.
I
Uh,
think in an earlier interview said they turned so many corners that they started going around in circles.
Correct.
So Shujbai, this again, just continuing this point because we've been the bad guys. We when I say Pakistan, we've been the bad guy, the neighborhood, the crook. The guys who, but the U.S. really hasn't been helpful to itself. I think in many ways, and to Pakistan and to region. I mean, continuing that on point, somewhere it says that 46 nations came together. They had 5 division equivalent areas and regional commands, and they were all fighting in a different world with a different strategy. So, do you think, with the current situation that we have in Afghanistan and the current rapprochement and the deal making that's happening, we're going to see an end of this massive confusion? I mean, I know I'm jumping ahead, but I'll come back. Yes.
Well, I'll put on my optimistic hat and say that Afghanistan is a very old country. And I think Pakistanis tend to forget that.
Yes.
We tend to have a kind of big brother attitude towards Afghanistan because we have a larger military, we have an economy that is doing much better than Afghanistan generally, and we are a nuclear power in Pakistan. So when Pakistanis get together, this is what informs their thinking. And during the period when General Musharraf was the president and the army chief, there was a particular condescension and a bias towards the Afghan leadership because they were seen as people that had been protected and even financed in some part by the intelligence services of Pakistan at some point in their fight against the Taliban or their fight against the Soviets. So there is this imbalance in that relationship, which informs Pakistani thinking about Afghanistan. But I believe Afghanistan has been around longer as a country, and they have what was described to me by well meaning and well informed people, particularly in what's now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, that Afghanistan survives on a balance of power created by a misake milli.
Yep.
They have a concord amongst the various component parts that are geographically separate, ethnically separate, different languages, different valleys, mountains separate them. They come together, and they come together when you have a relatively weak center. King,
Mm.
for instance, who was there, but he didn't have the total power over all aspects of life in Afghanistan. Uh, when the US went in, they created a strong center in Hamid Karzai. And he started putting his hands and his control over distant parts of the country. And I think that destroyed the fabric of Afghan politics and society to some extent, where it was even said that headmasters of schools were being appointed from Kabul. So in my view, if the Afghans get together, they will find a solution. And the less Pakistan gets involved in that process, the better. Of course, all the Afghans, and including people from the Northern Alliance, and I'm talking of people like Amrullah Saleh, with
Mhm.
whom I've had long conversations,
Mhm.
have said that Pakistan's interests need to be kept in mind. because Pakistan is a neighbor. And so if Pakistani interests are kept in mind, the Afghans will find a solution that will work to the regional advantage.
Shuja, this is really interesting because this has been echoed many times on the Pakistani side as well, especially General Kiani. Even now, General Bajwa, the Prime Minister Imran. I think there isn't any doubt in our mind that Afghanistan's well-being is in Pakistan's interest. But I want to highlight a particular point about the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, and this is again a quote from your book, and it says that uh, this is about the U.S. support for the Afghan jihad, and it said the U.S. involvement in the Afghan jihad that outstayed the Soviet government in Afghanistan where Pakistan took on the role of the facilitator. Many people don't know this, and I'm glad you've written this. The US provided the funding along with Saudi Arabia. They also helped design Islamic school curriculum for use in Afghan refugee camps to prepare and recruit warriors for this jihad against the US. Cheap weapons imported for the jihad leaked into Pakistani society, leaving behind the so-called Kalashnikov culture. And in that famous speech, Hillary Clinton said, we just walked away. Your views on this?
Well, this speaks for itself. And the failure on the part of the Pakistani authorities, and I think that Pakistani authorities should take some of the blame instead of solely blaming the United States. This was a relationship between consenting adults. They agreed to this at that time. Ziaul Haq was a political pariah on the global stage. He saw an opportunity, he took it. He worked the Americans beautifully. His ISI chief worked them beautifully. They worked very closely with Prince Turki Al Faisal, somebody that I know well and who has been very kind and gave me an on-the-record interview for Cross Swords, and we continue to remain in touch. And Prince Turki, in fact, had preceded American assistance for the Afghan jihad. The Americans were the second in line to come in, and then they rode on the coattails of the Saudis. But then they combined their efforts, and Pakistan was the means by which they managed to oust the Soviet Union. So yes, the Americans did all this, but they did it with a very willing partner on the part of Pakistan. And then when the time came for the second invasion of Afghanistan by the United States, which was done in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks on the United States, that occurred with Pakistani assistance. You also had a similar situation. You had a military dictator who had been deemed a usurper because he had upended a democratically elected prime minister, and he was a political pariah, and he had an opportunity to shift 180 degrees, which he did with great alacrity, without a great deal of thinking and foresight. My view is that a mistake was made in calculating how long the US intervention would be.
I think on both sides.
And what the US, what the US would give Pakistan as a result of this. In fact, I go into great detail in the section on military aid and economic aid, talking about how poorly negotiated the terms of the aid were, and how Pakistan essentially gave away everything in the shop for next to nothing. I mean, when you consider that, including the reimbursements, we're talking of $35 billion in this period that Pakistan received from the United States.
This is the period 2002 till 2011.
Exactly. Well, till now. Not
till now.
Till now. Till President Trump came into being.
Yes, so, till 2019, correct.
Whereas, in Afghanistan, they were spending over 100 billion a year. So there was a huge difference, and Pakistan failed to gain any benefit from allowing free access to its roads, its infrastructure. the damage that was caused, to its equipment, to its soldiers, to its training, all of that should have been taken into account, but it wasn't. And
And
so
Shuja, why do you think that didn't happen from your, insights that you have, not an opinion?
there was pressure on the part of the United States for General Musharraf to agree rapidly, for a decision to be
But
made.
subsequently, when they had more time to think through, and they had to see the agreements, and why didn't they look after their own interests?
When you look at my book, you'll come to the conclusion that I did, which was that it wasn't a whole of government approach to negotiating terms with the United States. It was primarily a military-led effort, and one of the weakest links within the military in Pakistan, even today, is the financial management and budget management. I mean, I've seen other militaries in action. I've talked to people in Europe, in the region, and over here. And one of the things that a commander from the lowest level in the military up to the highest level understands is that the budget is a management tool.
Correct.
In Pakistan, the budget is a pain in the neck that some civilian guy is going to sign off on simply because I put in the expense receipts. And that is the way it was treated. And so as a result, when I looked at the actual agreements that were signed, they were by low-level officials in the Ministry of Defense. Foreign Office was not involved, and they would have injected a note of caution, in my view, because they know how deals are made. And if the Finance Ministry had been brought in, they would have advised also. But the first question that I would have asked, and this was not asked, is how long is this going to last? How long is our internal battle in Pakistan going to last? How long do insurgencies commonly last? And the literature says 20, 25 years. And yet this was being seen as a quick in and out, and that we might get a little profit and we'll be fine.
So you do actually go into a lot of detail on this issue, Shuja. You actually listed in great detail the coalition support funds approval process, starting from the Pakistani side to the US side, and of course the claims and the counterclaims of stuff being not accurate or not validated, and that was the other part of the issue. So it's granted that this didn't have a whole of government approach, but let's look at General Kiani's period, where it seems from reading your book that perhaps that was the best grasp that a military leader in Pakistan was able to understand, and then articulate to the Americans about what the real challenges were for them in Afghanistan, how we could help. In fact, General Kiani, in your book, actually lists the 6 or 7 major criticisms that the US had against Pakistan. I'd like you to throw some light on that, Shuja.
Certainly. I think there are a couple of things that I would say about General Kiani. He had come from the ISI, so he had been responsible for a lot of the activities behind the scenes as the head of ISI with the Afghans and in Afghanistan and with the Americans. So he knew where the bones were buried. Secondly, I think this is where personalities come into play. He's a thoughtful person who reads. There are people in the Pakistan military who say they read, and they have a reputation for being readers, but they're not readers. There is no one, for instance, that I would say that I have run into who is, say, the equivalent of Jim Mattis in the United States, who has a personal library of 7,000 to 9,000 books. And wherever he went, one of the first things he did was he would tell his colleagues that here is my list of 20 top books that you should have read. If you haven't read them, read them.
Wow.
And so that kind of attention to detail and going into the heart of matter and going into historical matters and learning from history is something that needs to be done if a military is to reinvent itself every few years. Related to this was the fact that General Kiani did reinvent the Pakistan Army. he converted it from a very mobile, large, cumbersome force into
Immobile, you mean?
Immobile,
Yes.
cumbersome force into a mobile counterinsurgency army. He set up training operations. He transformed or helped transform the curriculum in all the training establishments. He was supported by people at what used to be the infantry school, at Staff College and at the military academy. And Rahil Sharif was the commandant who introduced some of those things that he brought in from Germany and other places to transform the training. So that when I went and sat in a class at the infantry school in Quetta, there were 13 people, I think, in that seminar. Couple were allied officers, but apart from them, and the major who was the instructor, everyone had been through fighting in Fatah.
Very
So,
battle hardened. Yes.
And here I want to digress for a minute. My own reading and my understanding of the military is that a military that has seen battle is always going to be at an advantage in a war situation against a military whose officers have not seen battle.
Correct.
There's a wonderful little story I want to share with you.
Please.
Jim Mattis, who's been a person I worked with and who's a friend, and I have a high regard for him as a person and as a military leader. When he was the Secretary of Defense in November 2018, I think it was around the 8th of November, he hosted a man from China. The man was, I've got a note over here to myself, Defense Minister Wei Fengzhe.
Okay.
And he hosted him to an evening in the Washington suburbs, not far from where I live.
Mm-hmm.
And they arranged a dinner and a Marine silent drill parade and so on at Mount Vernon, the estate of General George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to build a personal relationship. But in that process, he was also going to convey some messages to the Chinese defense minister. He knew that this person had been an officer in the artillery and rocket forces, but he also knew that Wei had not seen any action.
Oh, I see. Okay, interesting.
And so Mattis believed fervently that wartime experience was necessary for anyone to make the right decisions, and particularly not to make bad decisions about sending people into harm's way.
Correct.
Which people who don't have war experience tend
Absolutely.
to. They send people, young people, to die for them in war. And he said at one point to Defense Minister, he said, today in the US Army have seen war. Like it or not, due to various interventions in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, they have seen war. And if ever I go to war, I'd like to go to war against an enemy who is also not, because when we first hit, it is going to destroy everything that they've learned training. And they won't know what to fall back on, whereas my guys will. Mm-hmm. So coming back to Pakistan, General Kiani created this new, gave them a rationale within their own border. Because before that, you recall, there used to be desertions and there were all kinds of problems about with honors or not. And then finally, he explained the rationale. And once he won the military over, then the honors and the celebration, commemoration of the sacrifices was done. And the public gave its approval. So he's a transformative figure in that sense. However, he was perhaps a little too thoughtful, like President Obama. And for him to go into action on a large scale inside the country was something he avoided. And General Rahil Sharif took advantage of the infrastructure that had been built up and moved in Fatah, but nobody has moved inside the Punjab. And that is the remaining war that Pakistan needs to win.
Shujabai, but General Kiani had a view, and his view was that until and unless the hammer and the anvil strategy that he proposed, and his view was, I've had long conversations with him as well on the subject, and his view was that it was pointless taking on the last bastion, which was North Waziristan, after having cleared the six Fatah agencies earlier, and which really the bulk of the battle had already been fought before Zarbiaz was launched. I mean, we had nearly 4,000 casualties, and Zarbiaz in total has about 350. So the intensity of the battle can be seen, and he. He did not get according to him, he did not get the support from the Americans to block the insurgents coming onto the Afghan side. And what he would say was that it would result in a revolving door. They would go to there, go down to Kandahar, come into Quetta, back up, and it'll be pointless. And then he was also scared of the blowback within the hinterland, the interior of the country and in the larger urban cosmopolitan cities, Karachi, etc. So there was a lot of substance to that perspective.
I understand that, and I have explained that in my book also. He didn't want to see a long front extending from the border into the hinterland.
Correct.
However, as subsequent events proved, because he had the infrastructure and because he had the troops that after the success of the SWAT operations, there was something like 40,000 troops in North Waziristan.
Correct.
And they were raring to go into action. As one of my friends who was a general in the region explained to me, they were fighting a sitzkrieg, meaning it wasn't a blitzkrieg. They were sitting on their backsides, not being allowed to go out and take on and clear the camps and the training grounds and the arms depots and so on.
Shuja, you were saying that the people in Swat who were, after the Swat operation, people in Fatah were raring to go, but that didn't happen. So here's another perspective, that by the time Rahid Sharif came on the scene and Zarbias was launched, which is absolutely necessary, a very large part of the effective fighting force of the TTP had comprising a lot of the foreign elements, Arabs, Chechens, Uzbeks, Yemenis, people from Algeria, Egyptians, Saudis, had actually moved to the ISIS battle in Syria and Iraq. And as one former general told me, Heather, they left a chokidar in Fatah. So the blowback that General Kiani had anticipated didn't happen as a consequence of that. What do you say to that?
I think that may be an oversimplification.
Okay.
If you recall, when the operation in South Waziristan was launched, that was the first opening action by the Pakistan military. They allowed certain elements to escape into Afghanistan at that point also. And then many of them found their way back into North Waziristan. But once the SWAT operations were ended, the Pakistan military could strengthen its position in North Waziristan, and they had something like 40,000 troops there. So when the opportunity arose, then General Rahil Sharif was ready to launch. He was stopped by the Prime Minister, by Nawaz Sharif, who wanted to have a peace negotiations.
Correct.
And not even directly with the Taliban, the TTP, because they weren't prepared to talk to the government, but with their surrogates, which included the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which was a very bizarre kind of situation. And that delayed the process. But then the army moved into action rapidly and they cleared the area. But one of the effects of that was they also cleared the Chinese supporters.
Yes, they were.
ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement.
Correct.
Which allowed Pakistan to rehabilitate itself with the Chinese, who had been very unhappy that Fatah was being used as a training ground. So that's what happened. And then, of course, because the Afghan border is porous, you can't totally seal it. there continued to be reverse sanctuary. And not only from there, but also from Konar province and Nuristan and other areas from where, going back to the hammer and anvil discussion, the alliance, the Western alliance had moved their troops away from that region. There was only the Afghan army largely left in that area, and they were not well equipped nor well led. So you had an unsatisfactory situation there, which allowed infiltration back into Pakistan from the north, as well as into North Waziristan. And because of the links between the elements of the Taliban in North Waziristan and their contractors in the Punjab, you had the supply of weaponry and manpower going through North Waziristan into Afghanistan. It's a very complex situation, not very clear, and it wasn't simply that everyone decamped to Syria. I think that's an oversimplification.
Thank you for that. So, Shuja, General Kiani, because he was there for 6 years, right? And he really saw the whole operation starting from Swat at the tail end of General Musharraf's 2007, right up till the end of his 6 years. He has been complimented quite a lot by the Americans, and they thought that they had a great partner in General Kiani in achieving what the Americans thought were their goals in Afghanistan. And General Kiani had a problem with the Americans, in his perspective, not understanding the challenges that the Pakistanis faced in terms of the common tribal issues across the borders. And hence, in your book, you say 2011 really just shot everything to pieces. OBL, Salala, a lot happened. Memogate subsequently.
Yes. There was cooperation at two levels. There was at the strategic and military level between General Kiani and his counterparts, Admiral Mike Mullen, with whom I dealt a number of times and whom I briefed also. He and General Kiani had something like 26 meetings. And even after the break had occurred, after Mike Mullen had gone before Congress to declare the
ISI a veritable
arm of the ISI, they met in Seville on the outskirts of one of the NATO chiefs meeting when they were marking the 10th anniversary of 9/11. So there was that relationship. There was also a very powerful intelligence collaborative relationship that was enhanced by the presence of Lieutenant General Ahmed Shuja Pasha. But you know, the relationship between the intelligence agencies is always very much personality based also. And so when I interviewed the former station chiefs of the CIA, and a number of them were willing to speak to me, some on the record, they spoke very highly of the collaboration, particularly on the counterterrorism side. And if you remember, one of the CT DGs at the ISI later became the head of the ISI, and that was General Naveed. So you had a kind of continuity in that operation. Zahirul Islam was also involved as a second-tier major general at the ISI, and so when he became the head of the ISI, there was a relationship with him that was well maintained by the CIA station chiefs as well as by the US ambassadors. So these relationships are very critical at maintaining a balance, even when the political relationship between the United States and Pakistan was not as warm and fuzzy as it should be, or the economic relations started going south. So I think it's critical that we examine this. However, and I think the Pakistani leadership understood this, that you have to be alert that US friendship or friendship with any other country, including the Chinese, including the Brits, including the Germans, means that they will want to penetrate your country every which way from Sunday, to have their own people. They want to get information. They want to be able to manipulate decision making. They will use economic and other blandishments at a national level and also at an individual level to be able to turn people, which they successfully did. And the evidence that the Pakistan Army has provided itself, the number of senior people that were turned, and some that they haven't talked about, including the head of the 408 Intel Battalion in Rawalpindi, who is alleged to have helped the invasion of Abbottabad.
This is that Bailey fellow, huh? That
Now sitting in San Diego. That is something that's a reality that comes with the relationship.
Shuja, there's so much more to talk about, and I think people must read this book. But coming to what's happening now in the U.S. with Joe Biden and Trump going head to head, Joe Biden, in your book, has a very interesting quote when he's meeting Karzai, and Karzai is kind of going hammer and tongs as always against Pakistan, and Biden kind of stops him sharply and says, Mr. Karzai, Pakistan is 50 times more important to us than Afghanistan. That was a huge statement then.
It was. And when they disagreed, he threw down his napkin and walked out of the dinner, said this dinner.
Oh, did he?
So, yes, having briefed him a couple of times, once at his home, once at the White House, Joe Biden is a very real person. He doesn't put on a show. And so President Obama used him to convey the hard truths to their friends and allies and opponents whenever it was needed. And whenever he traveled to Afghanistan in his capacity as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he used to have with him people like Chuck Hagel, with whom I worked, who was then chairman of the Atlantic Council also. And he also had Lindsey Graham, and he had John McCain with him. They were, I think, Armed Services Committee chair. So with his team, he came to understand the region very well. And not many people know that when he was chairman, even when they were talking about what later became the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill, which actually was started on his watch, he had another plan, which was to give Pakistan an additional $1 billion a year in what he called a peace dividend, which would allow Pakistan to make the structural changes that were needed in its economy and its military and its society without any let or hindrance.
So why did that happen?
That didn't happen because he was made the vice president, and he left, and so you had a new. The peace dividend idea didn't go forward because when President Obama was elected, he chose Joe Biden to become his vice president, and so when he left, there was a new chairman, John Kerry, and then other things happened, and then of course. Not long after that, the relationship with Pakistan went south, as we talked about the watershed year of 2011, which culminated in the end in the attack on Salalah, which was an enormous blow to the relationship. And in spite of which, General Kiani offered a way out to the Americans in what I call Kiani 4.0, where he gave a new paper, which he delivered also to the NATO chiefs in Seville, and that he gave a copy to Jim Mattis when he was CENTCOM commander. But Jim Mattis's mission to Rawalpindi at that time was to read the riot act to General Kiani for an attack on the US embassy in Kabul, with which the Americans believed the Pakistani ISI had supported the preparation of the Taliban.
So Shuja, going back to Joe Biden. Joe Biden may likely, as it appears, be the next president of the United States, hopefully, and we have a more saner man in the White House. Some wouldn't agree with the statement, but so if Biden were president,
what do you see in the nature of the US-Pakistan relationships going forward?
I don't think it'll change things very dramatically, except that there is a greater possibility for a more considered recasting of the relationship. And that will be important for both sides to put it in those terms, because it's going to take a while. The other thing is this, that the COVID-19 pandemic has now changed the whole landscape. And Pakistan's stability and future growth will depend a lot on its ability to get out of the COVID-19 economic hole. It ended its recent fiscal year with a negative growth of 0.4%. For this year, the Asian Development Bank is talking of a 2% growth rate. It needs to be 7% and higher in order to stay even. It needs to create 1 million new jobs every year, and the government has been unable to do that, and in fact been unable to stem the rot of job losses. The power sector is still in a mess. The circular debt is still a problem. The tax system is still a shambles. No decisions are being made on the GST or the VAT in a manner that would be sustainable. We look at India, they're in an equally bad position. And that only because as India veers to the right, as it is doing, it is going to strengthen the forces that want to take Pakistan to the right. Both the civil and the military, because your military recruitment is now all city-based. Not all, but predominantly city-based. Pakistan is now largely an urban economy.
And an urban society, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Shuja, you know, I have this big white elephant paragraph, okay? It's not just one. The nature of the US-Pakistan relationships, and in the context of what you just mentioned about Pakistan's future prospects as a country, as a developed country, as a polity, there's Kashmir, which is not going to go away, however much you want to rationalize it. There's India and Modi, as you said, as they go right wing. There's China, and there's CPEC, and there's this overwhelming perception in Pakistan that, you know, because you can't rely on the US, so you got to rely on the other giant. Then there's the Saudi Iran, and when I say Saudi, I say that you know, notionally, because there are other forces behind them, and Iran, which completely dominate our landscape and our thinking in Pakistan. So that's on one side, the external piece, and then there's the internal piece, and you know, the complete destruction of any form of public sector institution over the last 70 years. Both civil and military administrations have combined. The elite capture of Pakistan, the dynastic politics that we see. You know, we see the son of Benazir, we see the daughter of Nawaz, and the loot and the plunder and the corruption. And I say that having seen this myself with insight. It's not a political opinion. And then we have the army. You know, the only seemingly effective, disciplined institution in a country, which is completely dysfunctional in terms of its civilian infrastructure. So these are these two massive, I don't know, sinking boats, I don't know what you call it, which we're desperately trying to keep Pakistan afloat.
Well, I talk in my book in the last chapter about the need to balance the centripetal versus the centrifugal forces.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the centripetal forces that bring the country together are economic in the large. You have a possibility because you already have a country that is economically well integrated, unlike India, where the states of the union have borders that are like the borders of what used to be Europe, where every country wants to extract its octroi at the boundary. In Pakistan, you can move from Chitral and open a business in Karachi.
Correct.
You can move from the Punjab and go to Quetta, which has happened. Quetta is a large metropolis, which now has more non-Baloch residents, I would guess, than Baloch residents. So the country economically and socially is well integrated because of mobility. And it's very critical that Pakistan strengthen these possibilities and allow a much closer relationship between the center and the periphery. Despite the 18th Amendment, which, in spite of all its critiques and faults, helped balance the polity of Pakistan, there is still a need to finish that job, perhaps in my view, by looking at the possibility of creation of more provinces so that you have a balanced polity. You don't have an imbalanced polity that you've had for 72 years. And once you have a more balanced polity, then allow the people, give them the space, and take it away from the bureaucracy, particularly in Islamabad, which is fighting to retain its control. I think behind a lot of this anti-18th Amendment movement is probably a lot of civil servants in the corridors of power of Islamabad. And I think the Prime Minister and the military, which have influence over decision-making, need to take a good hard look at it, because Pakistan will stand together on the basis of its component units. It was created as a federation and it'll survive as a federation.
Shuja, thank you very much. This is most enlightening, most insightful. I have not read a better book on India, on U.S.-Pakistan relationships, truly, and I want to repeat that it is a seminal book. It's a great, anyone who's in policy making, on decision making, in governance, military leadership, diplomacy, the researchers, the people with interest in history, the people with interest in understanding this policy. I think it will always remain fractured. I think the objectives of the two countries are so far apart, but I think they may find a way of keeping it on the tracks and on the rails, so it doesn't kind of go off like Salala or Memogate or or many others which I would have loved to discuss with you, or the 2 billion in undispersed funds from Kerry Lugar, or the couple of billion of unpaid in CSF. So yes, so there's hope from what I can see in what you've written, but there are two very, very different countries with very different objectives.
Thank you, Heather. And I do want to end on a note of caution. I think anyone reading the book should really take it as an attempt to create a better understanding of Pakistan and its institutions. And whatever thoughts or ideas that I'm presenting, I do so with a certain element of humility and modesty, because nobody has the right answers.
Correct.
The purpose is to generate some discussion and to force people into taking a fresh look at some issues. Maybe the answers that I present are too optimistic or too rosy-colored. They need to be looked at more critically and reshaped. But there are much better people inside Pakistan than me who are ready, willing, and able to undertake that task. And I think that's something that the government and the military can do, is to allow those voices to be heard, and particularly to realize that pluralism is a strength for Pakistan, that you don't have to all think alike, and groupthink destroys institutions. So that word of warning, I will end by thanking you again for a great and enlightening discussion.
Shuja, thank you very much. I have to call you Shuja now. I desisted from it. You're an elder, So, Shuja, thank you again. It was most insightful. I urge everyone in Pakistan who has even the remotest interest in understanding the nature of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship to read your book. I think it'll do everyone a lot of good. Thank you again, Shuja. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to catch up again soon.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you.